G'day guys, as you may already know, my name is Josh Robinson. I'm a professional US Formula Drift driver from Australia. At the moment, with all the craziness going on with COVID around the world, I thought I would capitalize on the downtime in the season to answer a question that I've been asked more than any over the last few years, which is how much does it cost for a foreign driver to realistically come and have a shot and throw their hat in the ring of the Formula Drift Championship? Each year I get dozens of emails and messages from both local and foreign drivers eager to stamp their mark on the drifting world in Formula Drift. And each one of them looks at it with rose-colored glasses and seemingly doesn't want to believe me when I lay out the budgets for them and also the level of commitment required to make a successful run at the championship. When I say level of commitment required, I'm not just talking about financially, but also the number of hours you have to work on your program each week, and also the sacrifices you make on things like not being able to go and see your friends and family. For me, particularly since it takes around 40 to 45 hours for me to get home, it means that I miss every single wedding, friend's birthday, significant life events and things like that. I only really get to see my friends for about 1 week per year. As an outsider looking in, trying to gather information from the live stream and social media posts and try to piece together and hazard a guess as to what goes into producing this circus is almost impossible, which in reality means that whatever the assumptions are that you've made are almost certainly incorrect. Particularly as a foreigner, you need to keep in mind the greats that have come and left America. Charles Ng, Darren McNamara, Mad Mike, Daigo Saito, and even James Dean for 7 years. Heck, even 3-time Formula Drift Japan champion Andy Gray came to America and he didn't make a top 16. As a foreigner, the odds are stacked immeasurably against you. While you learn a new culture, a new driving style, car setups, all while trying to battle it out with 16-year veterans of the sport on their home soil. I run what I would refer to as an upper mid-tier program here in the US. I say upper mid-tier because I don't have the luxurious overheads of a $500,000 Toyota home, a holiday house next to a racetrack, 6 spare pro cars, or an elaborate team of mechanics, media and transport to handle my logistics in the back end, and I certainly don't have any family money backing my program. But with that being said, my team does sleep in fairly respectable accommodation on a race weekend. I have a 3-year-old 40-foot race car transporter and a 8-year-old truck, which works probably about 70% of the time. What I'm getting at is I'm not the most budget guy in the field, but I probably spend around $1 million a season less than what the biggest guys drop. Yet my results are still within the top handful of drivers in my field. Before I embarked on this crazy US adventure, I did all the research and due diligence I possibly could. I spoke with foreign drivers, local teams, and basically anyone that would take my call. The majority of those came back at a figure of around $100,000 a season. Some of those broke that down into $10,000 per race weekend, plus $20,000 transport. Others gave me a lump sum of $100,000 a season, plus any major breakages like an engine and things like that. But either way, the number came out at around $100,000. Armed with this information, I surmised that I could run a Pro 2 program for around $60,000, plus the cost of building the car, a truck and trailer, and a spares package. I felt like the numbers I was being told of $10,000 per weekend were maybe a little bit light on, plus I always wanted to have a contingency up my sleeve just in case anything catastrophic happened. A year later, I ran into 2 of my trusted advisors. One of them was the foreign driver who told me the $10,000 per weekend plus $20,000 transport figure, and I politely said to him, "How the hell did you come up with that number? What happened to the hotels between rounds, the mechanics, all of these other things that go into bringing this program together?" And he simply replied, "I never added it up because I didn't want to know." My second advisor was the father of a guy that I've become really good friends with over the first year in the States. Over beers one afternoon, we got onto the topic of budgets, and he mentioned that he'd just signed a deal for his son for $250,000 for the following year, which I of course congratulated him on and said it must be fantastic to finally get his son's program off his books and to be not only funding it, but to be receiving a salary for driving. That's an amazing thing. He said to me very sheepishly, "Hey, after we discussed budgets last year, I actually started to add up some numbers and it wasn't 100 at all. He was putting in 250,000 And on top of that, now that they'd signed the deal for $250,000 with a company for the following season, he was going to continue to put in the same amount of money to help fast track his son's driving career. So the number wasn't really 100,000, it was 250, and it was going to be 500 for the following season. Now here's the thing, I have absolutely zero issue with people competing as a hobby, with family cash from their own living, wherever that money comes from. If you're in that situation, awesome. The problem comes though, if you're trying to do this professionally and the numbers that you've been given aren't what it's really going to cost, because you've got your budget expectations here and the level of sponsorship that you think you have to go and run the season, where in actual fact, the numbers end up being here. Your spreadsheet's never going to stack up and you're going to have a miserable time. Before we get to the numbers, I have a disclaimer. Do not rely on the information I'm about to tell you for anything. I used to be a Pizza Hut delivery driver. I am not an accountant. I am not a lawyer. I am not anything. I ran a few successful businesses, but I lost millions of dollars learning what I'm about to share with you. If you're planning on entering this series, particularly as a foreigner, if you don't 100% understand anything I am saying, do your research. Seek professional assistance, whatever you have to do. Know that motorsport is business, and learning business while competing in Formula Drift is like stabbing yourself in the leg, jumping in a shark-infested tank, and learning to swim, except that this death will be far more painful, dragged out over several years. So with that in mind, let's have a look at how much driving you actually get to do on a Formula Drift race weekend. If we look at the time from initiation to going across the finish line, most tracks take around 20 seconds to complete. In Pro 1, you should get just about all 12 of your maximum allowable practice runs, but in Pro 2, with no breakages and minimal track delays, I average 5 runs before qualifying. So I'll give you the breakdown of that really quickly here. You'll see that our first practice session here goes for 2 hours. Typically, I'll get about 3 runs in there, and here from 4 o'clock to 5:30, it's a 90-minute session. I'll probably get 2 more runs there. So those runs being 20 seconds each means that I'm going into the qualifying session with a total of 1 minute and 40 seconds of actual drifting time. Next, we've got qualifying down here, 2 runs, 20 seconds each. So there's another 40 seconds of driving time, and that's it for the first day. I was chatting with Formula Drift rookie Romcar Pontier a couple of weeks ago, and he finished 5th place in the championship this year. He told me that he averaged 2 practice runs per event, so it definitely pays to know how to work the grid and maximize your track time. And of course, during those qualifying runs, let's just hope that the organisers remember to turn the lights on, otherwise you're about to torch $5 grand on that run. And even if they did forget, there's no way they'd do it 2 events in a row. Next, we have the final tandem practice before the main event. Since half of the field is now on their way home, the track frees up a little bit, and you can usually get 3 runs depending on track delays or your car requiring attention. I keep on saying track delays because if someone drops oil, hits a wall, or goes into the kid litter, like most of the field does at Road Atlanta, it takes 20 plus minutes to clean up. So your 90-minute practice session becomes a single pass if you're lucky, or typically nothing at all. So let's be optimistic here and say you're going to get 3 runs in here, and that's usually the only time that you've managed to get any tandem practice in. I think most of the time I go into the main event having done 1 chase. So there's another 60 seconds of total drive time there. So that brings our running tally to 3 minutes and 20 seconds across the 2 days. After qualifying has finished, half the field gets sent home because in Pro 2 you only run a top 16. So if you make it into the top 16 and get your 2 runs, that will bring your total track time to 4 minutes. If you make it into the Great 8, that'll get you up to 4 minutes and 40 seconds. If you get into the top 4, that will get you to 5 minutes and 20 seconds. And if you make it to the final battle, which of course only 2 cars do, that will bring your weekend up to an endurance race-like amount of seat time at 6 minutes. Needless to say, I hope for your sake that every single one of your battles gets rerun 3 times, so maybe you can try and push these numbers out just a little bit. If you won every event, which no one has ever come close, you would finish the season with 24 minutes of drifting. Based on my 4th place finish in the championship in 2019, we can loosely estimate I did 18 minutes last year, or a bit over 16 with the lights actually on. Just one other thing before we get started on the fun stuff. The route that I went was obviously buying my own truck and trailer and doing it that way. You could definitely go and try and find a team in the US and rent a car for just the rounds that you want to do. But in my opinion, based on everything I've seen, the problem with doing that is that you don't really meet sponsors and do all those sorts of things on a Formula Drift weekend. You're so busy running around trying to like check the track out and do car setups and things like that. Like for me, I met the guys from V12 LS on Hot Rod Power Tour. I met Magnuson Superchargers and Duralast and BC Racing at SEMA and things like that. So unless you're doing the events outside of Formula Drift, I think you're going to have a really hard time trying to attract sponsors and sign deals. And also, if you're a foreign driver not based in the US and you fly out after each round, then it's even harder because in reality, they have 80 other teams in Formula Drift that they can do business with. And if you're not based here, like that's just another hurdle that they have to jump in dealing with you, which means that you're one step behind everyone else in trying to sign those deals. I hope you appreciate this PowerPoint presentation. I worked it out the other day. I haven't used this in 20 years, but this is the crazy things that drifting makes you do. I can also speak Japanese and drive a truck now, two things that I never had to do before I drove a drift car. First off, we've got the visa. It's $4,500 US, but there's no time limit on how long it takes for them to process it. So there's a $1,500 expedited option, which you really do need to take because then they get it done in 14 days. The only problem is that you can't be in the US while they process that, so you need to leave the country. In my case, I flew back to Australia for 6 weeks to get that processing done, but while I was there, President Donald Trump shut down the US government and it didn't get processed. So I was running out of time. I had to fly back to the US, pick up my truck and trailer in Texas, get to Orlando, compete. I flew out the next day to London for the week, did my interview there, and then flew back to Orlando, picked up the truck and trailer, drove to Road Atlanta, and competed the next day. The car. So I think that $100,000 is probably on the low side compared to what a lot of people spend these days. Certainly with my ute, because I had to make a carbon fiber body and there was so much development that went into it. The original build was $150,000. But what really caught me out was I fell into a bit of a trap with a guy that had been working with me for some time, and I had seen his work on entry-level practice / missile type cars, and he was always good at working with those. So I believed some things that I shouldn't have believed, and it meant that the car was only about half finished when I had to get shipped to the US for SEMA, and the quality of the build was exceptionally poor. So I can easily attribute an extra $100,000 worth of costs the following year, just trying to rebuild that ute from the ground up. And you might be thinking, how in the world is there $100,000 worth of rectification work? And quite simply, it's because if you imagine you've got, say, 3 guys with you on the other side of the world, that's 2 hotel rooms, 3 wages you're paying, plus the shop rate of $100 to $150 an hour, trying to get work done, trying to get to each round, trying to make all these things happen. So it was an absolute nightmare, but you live and learn. Shipping the car one way in a container from Melbourne in Australia to the US is about $6,000. Plus you need a thing called a carnet, which is basically a passport for valuable goods. And that guarantees that the goods will be shipped out of the country after 12 months. So there's no real way around that. If you're shipping goods in, but you have to pay taxes, you have to do declarations and all these things, but you do get that carnet or the bond back when the goods leave the country. The truck and trailer, I spent about $27,000 on my truck, and I think the trailer was about the same. Unfortunately, my friend that inspected the truck for me missed the fact that it needed tires and that the suspension was shot, so that was another $4,000 straight off the bat. And the trailer was just a bare bones trailer. It didn't have a winch, it didn't have tire racks or any of that stuff. So a semi-reasonable truck and trailer will easily set you back $60,000. So trailer setup, that covers things like the tools that you'll need, a generator, diagnostics equipment, the kitchen, bedding, microwave, fridge, a solar panel, a tire rack, all that sort of stuff. And again, I think 20,000 is on the low side, but I'm just putting a number in here for you to have in the back of your mind. A spares package. So this covers a engine, for example, a gearbox, spare control arms, suspensions, and body panels, whatever you need. If you're starting out, this is probably about what you're going to be spending. Accounting and legal. You are going to be on the other side of the world, incurring a lot of expenses, trying to land sponsors and things like that. You need a solid contract to get your sponsors to sign, and you also need to understand the ramifications of your taxation if you spend more than 180 days or 6 months in the US, which you almost certainly will if you're giving this a red hot go. So straight up, you've got 234,000. Again, that's on the low side with the car and things like that, but it's a good starting figure, I think. Next, we've got annual costs. Insurance. I have my truck and trailer and race car and ancillaries insured. The truck and trailer and race car, I think, is insured for just under 200,000, and I want to say that's about 2,500 a year. Maybe it's a little bit more. And my truck, again, because I'm a foreigner, you pay a premium for that. My truck insurance is almost 2,000 a year as well. Plus, I've got the 350Z for practicing in, but that's neither here nor there. The rig maintenance. The first year on a brand new trailer, we blew through 9 tyres because the 6 that it came with were just a really low quality tyre. And after replacing a bunch of those, one of them let go in a really bad spot on the highway that we couldn't pull over and stop. So we had to drive for a mile or two with a blown tyre. It started to shred, and then the wires went into the second 2 tyres, and that took out 3 tyres in one go. My dad drove my truck once and bent an axle on the trailer. That was $2,000. My truck, I had to do both front hubs. They were $800 each just recently. A turbo was $3,500. Again, like $5,000 is definitely on the low side, but we're staying positive. Formula drift fees. 4 hard cards, and the annual fee is approximately $4,000. For Pro 1, that's probably between 6,000 and 8,000. They charge you per person that you have on the grid. So if you're running a big team, like some of these teams that have 18 plus people, I can only imagine what sort of costs they have. This is only 4 guys plus a driver, so it's a really small team compared to a lot of the bigger ones. 3 international flights. Again, if you're coming from Europe or Australia, you've got 4 rounds of the championship. You've also got SEMA and all these other events you have to do outside of Formula Drift to try and get your name out there and to keep sponsors happy. So that's 3 flights just for you. Maybe if you can get a little bit cheaper, that means that you're flying out a mechanic or a media guy or something with you. Again, that's probably on the low side if you're using other foreigners, but hopefully you can find some local guys and try and keep that on track. Workshop and storage. So somewhere to keep your truck and trailer, do the maintenance work between rounds or in the off season and things like that. It would be very expensive to try and set up a shop on your own in the first instance, but also you'll probably be paying someone something to rent some shop space off them to take care of your setup and to store it when it's not being used. Gifts, $5,000. You might be wondering why you're giving out gifts, but the thing is that if you're approaching people to get sponsorship and you are landing sponsors and things like that, it's really important to maintain those relationships and show your appreciation. So for Christmas and things like that, sending out gifts, like having a good relationship, saying thank you to people, staying in the spirit of things is really, really important. So I would say that realistically, around $5,000 a year is what I spend on gifts and showing my appreciation to the people that support my program. So that brings us to $30,800 for our annual costs. Next, we've got the actual costs for a race weekend at the track. Tyres, 32 each at $100. Depending on where you finish up in the field, you might not use all 32 tyres, but I'll cover that later on in the practice weekends. Accommodation. You have to arrive on a Wednesday and compete and practice Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then you roll out on Sunday. Personally, for whatever reason, I don't expect my guys to share beds. I can't imagine anything worse than doing a long day at the track, busting balls, and then have to cuddle up next to some dirty, sweaty mechanic. So I don't expect any of my guys to share beds, but a lot of teams do. So my budget is $1,500 for the weekend, and we typically get an Airbnb just because it's a little bit more friendly than everyone sitting in hotel rooms staring at the ceiling. Food, $50 per person per day, and that's allowing for 5 guys. That's you as the driver, a media guy, a spotter, and 2 mechanics. And to be honest, I think that 2 mechanics is too low. I always run 3 mechanics, but my spotter I split the cost with another team, so I don't have to transport that guy or house him, but he does get a wage for the weekend. But that keeps down my costs on having to get an extra bed, an extra flight, and a second car, so we can all fit in one truck with 5 guys. So I've got there $1,000 for the 4 days. Wages, 500 per guy, excluding you as the driver. Over the years, I've seen just about everything when it comes to mechanics at Formula Drift. I know that a lot of top 8 Pro 1 teams don't actually pay their guys. They've just got a really good relationship. They're there for the love of the sport. They love the driver, all that stuff. Personally, I think that the guys should get at least a few dollars in their back pocket for coming out and sweating it out on the grid with you. A typical rate that I've heard from a lot of teams is around 500 for the weekend, which again, it's not a huge amount of money if you consider that you have to fly out on the Wednesday, you don't get home till the Saturday or Sunday, but it is a pretty awesome thing to be a part of, and it's certainly an adventure. Over the years, I haven't really seen any difference between a guy who's paid to be there and not paid to be there. I've had a guy that was 10 years into Formula Drift and a very experienced mechanic and crew chief. And in one season working with me, he forgot the keys for the trailer. One day when we were going out for testing, so we had to cut the locks of the trailer. At another round, in fact, at Road Atlanta, he forgot to latch the hood twice, and on the second occasion that blew up and did a lot of damage to the car. At St. Louis, he left some shop towel in the engine bay and set fire to the car, and then at the end of the year, when we went to pull the car down to check it over, he'd actually plumbed the radiator back to front, so we'd been getting a false reading on the dash, and we had cracked the engine block and lost an engine. So honestly, it's always a roll of the dice. People will say anything to get on your Formula Drift team because they want to be a part of it, which I get, but the problem is that if they're not up to the task, you're going to find out at the most inconvenient of times, and it's your neck on the chopping block, and you're the one that's going to cop the flack for having a team that got the job wrong. Race fuel, $300, pretty straightforward. Flights, this is internally within the US. Typically I try to get the guys to leave their clothes and gear in the rig, and it gets transported from round to round. That way it keeps down the crazy baggage charges that they have in the US. Typically you can get a flight for about $400 to most places, and so that's for your 4 guys, and obviously as the 5th, that's you, you're going to be driving the rig, so you're not included here. Contingency, $2,000. That could be a clutch, an axle, some control arms if you drop a tire, a wheel, you name it. You're almost certainly going to be spending $2,000 on something at the absolute minimum over the course of the weekend. And transport for $1,000, that covers the diesel to get to the event and back, and maybe a night or 2 accommodation each way. So all up, an actual race weekend hard costs is $12,600, times by the 4 weekends gets you to $50,400. Next up, we've got practice weekends. Once you are in Formula Drift, most events will let you go and drive their events free because you've got a little bit of clout, and people will come and pay to spectate you crashing your very expensive Formula Drift car. So most events will let you in for free. Tires, I've got 10 here at $100 each. Again, that's really not much practice when a car goes through a pair of tires in 40 seconds, but the chances are you'll have some leftovers from Formula Drift which you can repurpose and pad out the weekend with those. Accommodation, this is assuming that you are driving out probably on a Friday after work or something like that. So you'll have Friday night and Saturday night accommodation. Again, not a very fancy hotel, just a twin share thing, $100 per night, gets you to $200 for the weekend. Wages, I'm going to put nothing here. I'm going to put it at 0 because hopefully all this doesn't stress you out so much that everyone thinks you're a complete asshole, and they'll give you a hand for free. Or it's a sympathy hand. Either way, a win is a win. Race fuel, again, $300. Flights, nothing. This is assuming that you and your friend are just jumping in the truck and driving out. to a local event. Contingency, $1,000, same as a normal race weekend. That could be an axle or a wheel or some lower control arms or whatever it may be. Transport, this is just a bit of gas to get out there and back at $500. So the total for a regular practice weekend is $3,200, assuming you're going to have a testing or something like that between each Formula Drift round. That brings that up to $12,800. Next, we've got between the events. So this is tearing down the car, making sure everything's still okay, the clutch is good, the teeth on the gearbox look good, and things like that. The parts and labour in doing that, shipping them out, the maintenance and so forth. I would spend multiples of this per round, particularly when we were trying to do development and get the chassis up to spec. If you were running an LS powered 350Z with Wisefab on it, maybe it will be a little bit less, but I really don't think that $3,000 is unreasonable. I know that I spend multiples of that. So I'm going to put that down at $3,000 for the 4 events, which gets us to $12,000. And the hotel between rounds, I have 15 nights here because I think that I need to put in a number here. In reality, for me, I thought that I was going to spend 3 months in the US for the first year that I was here. And when I saw the massive undertaking it was and trying to get all the rectification work done on the ute and make it competitive, I ended up spending 10 months here. So you can imagine what my bill ended up being for the first 12 months. So if everything goes smoothly, you really only fly in for a couple of days before the Formula Drift round and then you fly back out again. Maybe you can do it on 15 nights. Again, this is super low. So let's put it at $6,000 for the year. Annual contingency. This could be blowing a car or a truck motor. As I said before, my dad drove my truck for the first time and shortcut a corner, broke an axle on my trailer. It could be losing a gearbox, a generator, anything getting stolen, $30,000. The thing to note really here is that you can go into this with hopes and dreams and expecting, oh, nothing bad will ever happen. But the reality of the situation is, I remember in one season, Chris Forsberg lost 8 engines. Papadakis lost 4, and that was before Orlando. And I remember one year at Orlando as well that Vaughan and Chelsea lost 3 engines just at that one round. So you can go into it crossing your fingers and saying your prayers, but ultimately, stuff happens all the time. You don't drive 30,000 kilometers a year around a foreign country without things popping up. It's just the nature of the beast. So our first year expenses, the setup costs at $234,000, the annual costs at $30,800, the race weekends at $50,400, the practice weekends at $12,800, between the events at $18,000. Plus we've got the annual contingency of $30,000. That brings us right up to hopefully $376,000 US, which is right around 550,000 Australian dollars. Here's something else that's really important that everyone else just seems to glaze over. If you incur an expense, say for $500 US dollars, the top taxation rate in Australia is almost 50%. That means you have to earn $1,000 to spend $500 that you don't have a receipt for. Sponsors don't just give you cash in hand. You have to write them invoices. So you as a pro driver don't have an ability to earn cash because everything's declared. Now with the exchange rate between Australia and the US at the moment, that means that $1,000 actually costs you almost $2,000. So something that seemingly is an okay price at $500, but you don't have a receipt for taxation, ends up costing you $2,000. Now you might be thinking that things are cheaper in America, therefore it kind of works out with the exchange rate, but believe me when I say that money spends the exact same in America as it does in Australia. If you're at a racetrack, it costs $10 to get a tyre changed. If you go out for an okay meal somewhere with a friend, you're going to be spending $80. Regardless of the currency, the money actually spends the exact same, if not worse, in the US than Australia. So divide that between your 18 minutes of actual drifting for the season. That gets you right around $20,888 US dollars per minute. Now, of course, at the end of the year, if you were to factor in the resale value of the assets after 12 months, your race car has copped an enormous amount of depreciation on it. If you've spent $250,000 on that car, realistically, the best you're ever going to get for that is $80,000 or $90,000. If you spend $100,000, who knows? Like you might get 40 to 55,000 if you're lucky. So you've taken that depreciation hit and accounted for that, which gets you to right around $15,000 per minute of Formula Drift track time. That's assuming you finish in 4th place, where I did last year. Now you might be thinking, earlier on I said I lost millions of dollars doing this. And as you can see here, there's some costs here, but there's not millions of dollars here. And so basically what happened to me is, because when the ute was being built in Australia, the guy that was project managing it did such a poor job, I had to keep on taking time out of my day to handle so many aspects of that. And when the ute left Australia and got shipped to the US, it was on a deadline to get presented at SEMA, so it got shipped realistically not even half finished. It looked like it was 90% finished, but it really wasn't. And so the amount of time and energy that took out of me meant that I wasn't giving the correct amount of due care and attention to my companies back in Australia. And so, as you can imagine, I have a business partner in one of those companies, and he got really mad at me with the amount of time that I was spending working on my race program and not in the company, which is totally fair enough. And so I ended up having to sell my company to appease him and to make good on my promises and contracts that I've written in the US. And so when I say the level of commitment required and the hours that I put into it, on the next page here is just a quick idea of what a normal 100 to 120 hour work week looks like. I'll finish on this slide. If you'd like, pause the video, you can read through and have a quick look. Again, this isn't a particularly out of the ordinary week. This is every day of my life for the first 2 years I was in the US. The amount of work that goes into this was just phenomenal. Trying to figure out what a Wells Fargo is and a Harbor Freight and things like that. Like, the names of companies don't mean anything to you as a foreigner. And so trying to figure out your way around the country, understand all these things, was a monumental undertaking. So there you have it. Hopefully I haven't crushed too many dreams, but I've given you the tools to set some goals and go and chase your dreams. As they say, good fortune favours the well prepared. They also say that in order to become a millionaire from racing, you first must be a billionaire. All I'll say is just remember the level of business acumen required to succeed in professional drifting. You're literally approaching companies, telling them that you're going to do a glorified burnout, and somehow they're going to make money from that. If guys like Vaughn Gittin Jr., JTP, Chelsea Denofa, or any of the original guys went into private enterprise with their level of business acumen and skill set and determination, undoubtedly they would be rivaling Jeff Bezos for wealth. At a guess, there's probably only around 10 of us in the world that make a living from drifting, and in my case, it may only be a few dollars an hour. If you're wondering if I was happier back home with lots of money and all of life's luxuries, but commuting the same 2 minutes to work each day and cooped up in a 6x6 office, or now sleeping in my truck on the side of the highway in a foreign country when it breaks down, working 100+ hour weeks with zero financial certainty, but chipping away at a big picture idea, I have to say, as strange as it sounds, I have found my calling. And that, I guess, is the power of chasing your dreams. Stay well.